So first, I start all my presentations since 2015, reaffirming the SDG 4, the Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is the one specific for education, which is that we want to ensure inclusive and quality education for all and promote lifelong learning, which sounds too general, but it is important to understand that after the year 2000, when in Dakar we have made created one of the millennium goals, stating that we would assure just access to primary education to all children. This is a much broader goal, and Brazil is one of the 194 countries that have signed to this goal, whatever the new government thinks about it now.
No,
Sorry?
No, not
yeah.
Yeah,
Yes. And this goal, is there a problem?
Yeah, we couldn't hear you.
Oh, and now you hear me?
Yeah. So you need
Yeah,
to.
okay. So let me make sure that everything is okay. So this SDG 4 is split among some targets, and I just brought 3 to give you a taste of what Brazil has agreed to follow. And one of them is that we will, by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes, which means it's not only about ensuring access to education, it's ensuring access to quality education expressed in relevant learning outcomes, and also that we have to ensure completion and not only access of primary and secondary, which in the case of Brazil means till the end of high school, which is really challenging because first, nowadays only 64% of young people in Brazil complete high school till the age of 19, which means 2 years more than the mandatory, than the correct age for conclusion. Second, that it is about quality, and quality is not about fancy things, it's about learning. That's why the leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes is important. And third, that we will make sure to assess learning. So, and although we do have an experience with assessing learning, INEP which is the Brazilian bureaucracy responsible for assessments, is good quality, is professionalized, but it is a very difficult guarantee that we have established for us. And the latest PISA results have shown the difficulty that we have in ensuring learning. And there are reasons for that before I advance. In 1930, when Argentina already had 62% of the kids in primary, Chile had 7%, Brazil had only 21.5% of kids in schools. Well, Korea was almost at the same level as Brazil in 1930. But when we go to the end of the 60s, of the 1960s, Korea had already universalized the access to primary, and we were still at 40% of the kids in school. So that excellent, quote unquote, schools of the past, where as the social networks established, your grandmother or your mother studied, was a school for only 40% of the kids. And since I studied at that time, I know it was just for the kids of affluent families, with a few exceptions. And Brazil was quite rural, so the kids that had no access to schools were quite invisible. So Brazil universalized access to primary and lower secondary by the beginning of the 21st century. So we were very late to universalize access. Part of our challenges with learning is connected to that. The economists among you might know that Naércio did research on the factors that influence, that impact learning outside school, and 68% of a child's success in schools in Brazil is connected to the average years of schooling of their parents. So just to make myself better understood on the size of our challenge. That doesn't mean that we have only to look at the past, because also in what connects to public policies, we did have some advances, not only in access, but even in learning, but they are too slow and too limited to be considered that we are going in the right direction. So another target that should be mentioned is connected to early childhood. We have agreed that by 2030, which is 10 years to go from now, that we would ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development care and pre-primary, so that they are ready to primary education. We had made some important advances in that, especially access to preschool. So Brazil has established a target, which is that by 2016, we would have universalized the access to pre-primary 4 and 5s. We are not there yet, but it's already 94% of Brazilian kids that 4 and 5s that are in schools. Not a good quality preschool, but we are advancing in the right direction. And the third and last target that I'm going to mention today from the ODS, the SDG 4, is that by 2030, we will substantially increase the number of youth and adults who have relevant skills, including technical and vocational, for employment, decent jobs, and entrepreneurship. And if this means something important for us, because it's not only about ensuring that the present cohorts of children who are in schools, that they conclude quality education, but it is also looking at the ones that were excluded from access to education and making sure that they also get prepared for what they need to have a future. But my point, and then I will advance with the challenges that the future brings to Brazil, is that the future is very complicated for the country. First, because of the so-called fourth industrial revolution. So we are seeing in the world, and I was one of the members of the global Commission on the Future of Work from ILO, from the International Labor Organization, we are facing accelerated automation, or you can use the word robotization for artificial intelligence, with an accelerated job extinction. Some scholars project huge numbers of job extinction. And yes, you may say, well, new jobs will be created, like in the previous waves of industrial revolution, but not for the same skills. They will demand much more sophisticated skills, and Brazil is not even delivering the basic skills for the school system. And I want you to have a figure in mind, which is that 81.7% of school-age children and adolescents in Brazil are in public schools. So private schools is a huge exception in Brazil, and it is related to income and years of schooling of the parents. Another challenge that will be facing, or we are already facing, is that it is not only about the developed world when we mention robots or automation. It is also about the developing world, because reshoring and restructuring of international companies is happening right now in most parts of the developed world, taking advantage of this accelerated automation. So cheap labor is not so cheap as it used to be, and machines can do the work of many, quote unquote, cheap laborers. And this is impacting labor in Brazil as well. Brazil is a very unequal country, one of the most unequal in the world. But we have been reducing in the last decade inequality a little bit, not so anymore. So we have been facing a growth in inequality, and this is harming our future, is menacing what we can do with the economy and also with schools. We still have stagnated productivity in Brazil and in some countries in Latin America, but in Brazil more than in others. And at a very low level. And productivity at a very low level has a connection with the quality of education, and not only with the access to education. And last but not least, and this is not unique to us, we have a fragile citizenship, and we are facing right now populism in our country. As I mentioned, we are not unique in that the world is facing populism. And fragile citizenship has a connection not with years of schoolings, but with what we teach to young people and how we prepare the next generation. So the next thing that I brought to speak to you is how learning is not happening in Brazil. And I brought the data from PISA 2018 that was delivered in the beginning of December. So, Brazil in PISA. We have been participating in PISA since 2000. And we are at the bottom third since 2000. In the first one, we were the last country in the ranking, the PISA ranking. And from then on, we have not moved in an impressive way. we have been one of, from 2003 to 2012, we were the country that improved the most in mathematics. But to improve when you are very low in your performance, to be the country that improved the most is not difficult when you are very low. And what happened compared to the PISA 2015? We have slightly improved the score in the 3 areas assessed, but we are still displaying a very poor performance. We are among the 20 worst countries. We are above Argentina, which is, if you remember that I mentioned that in 2030, Argentina had already 62% of the kids in schools, and we had just 21%. So it says more about Argentina than about us. So we are above Argentina, above Colombia, and above Panama, but we are still among 69, I think it's 70 countries. We are in 54th position, so we are still doing very poorly. A very important figure is that 43% of our kids do not reach a minimum level of proficiency in any of the 3 abilities assessed. For those of you who might not be familiar with PISA, it's about mathematical reasoning, science, developing a research-oriented mindset, and reading and interpretation of texts, including much modern ways of literacy. And what also caught my attention is that the richest young people from the Brazilian sample in PISA had a better performance than the poorest kids. It's natural. But worse than the poorest from many countries and economies, including Hong Kong. Somebody mentioned Hong Kong. So we are, even the elite kids are performing worse than the poorest from many countries. Well, so having set the scene, showing what we have signed that we and another 193 countries would do, and showing how we are performing right now, what are the main problems of Brazil in education? From my personal analysis and from the literature as well. So we have a big difficulty to attract the best students to the teaching profession. When in PISA, they asked the 15 years old, what is the profession of your dreams? What do you intend to be when you grow old? Only 2.9% said that they want to become teachers. On the other hand, when there is the entrance exam for the universities, many high school graduates go to the teaching profession. Why? Because it's not very competitive. It's very easy to acquire an undergraduate diploma if you study education. So it is for the wrong reasons. We are not attracting enough talent to the profession. But to make things worse, so there was one research that showed that the bottom 25% of the students from high school that end up becoming teachers in Brazil. To make things worse, teachers receive their pre-service education, yes, in tertiary, in higher education, but often in a course where there is no dialogue between practice and theory. They learn theory, but they learn a theory that is completely unconnected with practice. It is as if I were preparing a future doctor or physician, and they are not exposed to real patients. They don't have, as even in Brazil they do. You, since day one in the medical school, you go to the hospital that is referred to that university. In Brazil, no, you can study for, if you want to become a teacher, let's say of mathematics, you learn mathematics for 3.5 years, and then the last semester of your course, you study history of education, philosophy of education, sociology of education in classes that where future teachers of arts, of biology, of physics will be all together in big auditoriums. And then for 4 months you take some kind of an internship that could be even ritualistic. So this is a huge problem because they are not really prepared to become teachers. And to add to that, 46% of the future teachers study in through distance learning, through online courses, which sounds great because of technology, but they are even less experimental than the course that are given by more traditional universities. And traditional teaching is not capturing the students' interests, and this engagement is present in most secondary schools, especially the public schools. Most of the high schools don't have any lab. Internet connection is used for administrative work. What to say about hands-on learning or things like that. There is a huge repetition rate, contrary to what people say in Brazil, where they say there is a big pressure to make kids not repeat grades, and dropout rates are correlated to those high repetition rates. I am a mentor of many secretaries of education, state level and municipal level. And I was discussing with the Secretary of Education of one of the states, and he was showing me the data, how repetition, the kids that repeat more than once the grade, they end up leaving schools. And for one, dropout rates are not only connected to this high repetition, but young people are not convinced that education will bring them a higher future. There is an issue with expectations in Brazil. Low expectations for poor people, and even the young people, the youth themselves, they have low expectations for them. And a very low coverage of early childhood programs, especially among the poorest, which means, yes, pre-K programs could have an impact in equalizing opportunities, but the most vulnerable have very limited access to crashes, to nursery schools. Okay, if I can continue on the problems and the data, technical schools has a very low coverage, and it is divorced from the needs of the country. There is very limited conversation with future employers on the design and in the offer of TVET, of technical and vocational schools. Only 8% of high schoolers go to professional schools. We have also another issue with reduced hours of instruction. Very often when I mention this, some people from other countries say, yes, but hours of instruction are not that important. Well, but there is a minimum below which it's very difficult to have some classes where you teach kids how to think, how to develop critical reasoning, to really reason mathematically or historically. So in an average, we have in high schools 4 hours of instruction. And this includes lunch and recess. So you can imagine that effective instruction is limited to 2 hours and 30 or something like that. So this is a huge problem for us. Prejudice against standards and techniques. Yes, it's very important to empower teachers to create their own class. But as in medicine, there are some things that work more than others. To have some standards is important. For many years, we were against having any kind of national curriculum, or although our constitution established that we should have what we call Base Nacional Comum Curricular, which is a kind of pre-national curriculum. We ended up delivering on our Base, creating our pre-curriculum. Lehman Center had a role in that. Not only the Lehman Center, but it has an important role on that. But we still, this pre-curriculum was translated into 26 state-level curricula, and one for the federal district as well. So now the states with their municipalities already have their own curricula for elementary and middle schools, and for preschools and creches. But we need to do this, continue with this effort with high schools, which we haven't completed as yet. But we still have to face our prejudice against standards and techniques. There is little emphasis on experimentation and in problem-solving skills that are very important for the period that we are dealing with right now, and a huge education inequality. So schools, instead of being an equalizing tool for building equality of opportunities, schools reproduce and even enhance the inequality that we have, which is very saddening. So, what is, I believe, the education ecosystem of the future, and how does Brazil, what exactly Brazil should consider as we try to improve the quality of education here? So first, we will not face, if we look at the whole system of education, including higher ed, we will have schools, TVET schools, universities, skills counseling agencies connected to guide students and professionals throughout their lifelong learning journey. Why am I mentioning this? Because with this future of work situation, with that situation where jobs will be extinct in successive waves of extinction, we will need schools where from a very young age, we learn to learn. We become independent, autonomous learners. And we are not there as yet. In most of the world, can you imagine how we are in Brazil right now? So in that context, what will happen in the future is that it's not enough to have universities, it's not enough to have TVET schools. We will have to have a system where, yes, universities will continue to exist, regular schools also, but adults will need to reinvent themselves quite often. So they are in for a lifelong learning journey. This new ecosystem will also comprise global education platforms and different education durations and formats. Mentoring, coaching, and collaborative work will also be invaluable sources of learning. And learners will have to be autonomous, but at the same time, something that is apparently contradictory with that, also able to take advantage of collaboration. I would dare to say that you can only collaborate if you are autonomous, if you have the capacity to have some kind of self-control, of self-management, which is difficult to teach, but important. So what are the education trends for the future? Countries that have been successful in education, what are they considering right now as an evolution or even implementing? And Brazil should look at that. So first and foremost, it's not about computers. It's about focusing collaborative problem solving with creativity, learning to solve problems together in an interdisciplinary approach, and using creativity is something that robots are not there yet. So we won't be easily substituted by robots in doing this. It is interesting to see that PISA has included that in the areas where they assess students. Personalization. Personalization, for me, because there are many definitions of personalization, doesn't mean not working, not having a normal classroom anymore. It means understanding exactly what are the gaps in knowledge that the students have, addressing them directly, dealing with different interests that kids have, dealing with difference in attention spans and things like that. And many countries are moving in this direction. They are, yes, taking advantage of technology with adaptive platforms that are starting to appear here in Brazil in private school settings, but not as yet in public school settings. Curricular flexibility, and you might think that how come I was talking about the importance of standards and curricula? Why am I mentioning curricular flexibility? Yes, the fact that you establish areas where you believe that all Brazilians need to develop capabilities or competences doesn't mean that we have to take the same approach to all learners, all schools, all states, and so on. So you have to have some kind of a curriculum, but it needs to be flexible. And it is not, and we shouldn't make it fragmented. Edgar Morin came to Brazil. I don't know if you are familiar with him. Edgar Morin is right now 97 years old, and he's a philosopher of education, a humanist. And he said that he wrote a wonderful book on the French education system. And he named it, it's about high schools more than anything. And he said that it's absurd how in high schools they have 7 hours a day and 8 mandatory subjects in high school. This is the fragmentation of the knowledge, and it's absurd. And when I read that book, I thought, if he discovers that in Brazil it's just 4 hours and it's 13 mandatory subjects, recently we changed that, and it's going to be implemented by the beginning of next year. But we are very fragmented, and the disciplines, the subject areas don't talk to one another. Another trend for the future is that the teacher is progressively moving from being a class provider to being a learning insurer. So the teacher not necessarily is a speaker, the teacher in K-12. It's not, or especially in secondary, it's not a speaker. It's about ensuring learners, learning. Teaching to think, to prototype, and promote deep learning. Deep learning is something connected today to machine learning, but I used on purpose deep learning here to mean that it's important that we deal with less topics, but that we are able to help students develop a method of looking into things in a deep way, trying to understand deeply what they are learning. Promoting a digital culture while teaching sophisticated literacy. Marianne Wolf says that we have to develop both literacies, the digital literacy, and even when we teach how to read texts from books, we have to deal with 2 different kinds of literacy. The digital literacy, even to read text, and the literacy, what we traditionally have been calling the reading literacy. Cognitive skills associated with social and emotional skills. It's not about teaching as a topic, empathy or resilience or persistence or grit, but having the teachers learn, even the subject teachers, the specialist teachers, learning to develop their own social and emotional skills to develop those skills in a purposeful manner in their students. And developing student agency, which is one of the latest papers from OECD education. It was mentioned as one of the most important attitudes, values, the developing student agency, which is not only building autonomy on the learners, but also preparing them to be the protagonists or the entrepreneurs of their own student life and of their own future life. I mentioned this topic because in the BASI, in our pre-curriculum, national curriculum, we have introduced this expression, protagonism, as something to be taught in what we call Fundamental 2, which is middle school and high school, ensino médio, which is to prepare young people to be more autonomous, but at the same time to participate in their communities as citizens, and to have a conception of global citizenship that sees a connection or a net of communities. I'm a member of my school community, of my community, in my city, in my country, and I'm a citizen of the world at the same time. So those are the trends that I think should highlight what we need to achieve in education in Brazil to be ready for the future. I just prepared a list of, this is a personal brainstorming. I was preparing this presentation and I thought, what makes us different from robots? Because if we are to be substituted by robots in the future, what remains to us, and what should we teach in schools to make young people ready for the future? So this is just a list: empathy, persistence, and grit, especially for vulnerable kids, and for building equity, critical thinking, abstract thinking, and systemic thinking, which I copied from Joseph Aoun, who wrote an interesting book called Robot-Proof Higher Education. Universities should be teaching that, but K-12 as well. Self-regulation. And then from Leonardo da Vinci biography from Walter Isaacson, I stole this reflection on what made Leonardo da Vinci so interesting, which is curiosity, creativity, and imagination. Robots are not good at curiosity and imagination. Human beings are. So we should emphasize what makes us human in the schooling. And finally, and I mentioned that already, entrepreneurship and student agency. A quick reflection of what means becoming a teacher, what is being a teacher in these times of changes. So, as I mentioned before, we should prepare future teachers to change their role from being a mere provider of classes to become an ensurer of learning, and at the same time to being a researcher, but not a researcher of only theoretical things, but as a researcher of their own students, of the way they are learning, of how they connect to what you as a teacher is teaching. Develop professional pride. In Brazil, there is an attitude very hypocritical about teachers. We teach the teachers. We don't teach, and we don't treat them as professionals. So you cannot develop professional pride if everybody treats you with pity and not as a professional. And you cannot develop professional pride if you are just complaining, focused on your insufficiencies of what you are not receiving. So at the same time as we should improve their quality of work, we should help teachers develop professional pride. They are not creatures that should be, and I say this being a teacher and having been a teacher of elementary schools. So we need to develop professional pride, even to demand better working conditions. We need to compensate the now very theoretical pre-service education with collaborative learning. When I went to Stanford the last time, I saw some wonderful presentation that Paula Lozano was there, and she took me to see presentation. I think it was Rachel that was giving to high school teachers, where they showed some kind of learning communities developed among high school teachers, a virtual one, and so a tool to help teachers. So collaborative learning might be something much more important than thinking about going to to have your master or PhD. Because if it is, as it is in most of our universities in Brazil, also completely divorced from the reality of the real classroom, we will continue to be just theorists and not professionals. Working collaborative with peers in planning classes. Brazil has created a very interesting law that 1/3 of the time of a teacher is devoted to non-class activities. Instead of using this time for collaboration, some cities are paying for the teachers 1/3 more instead of having them have the time for collaboration, or saying to them, you have this 1/3 of your time, so do it at home. So you don't take advantage of peer learning and peer work. Creating a growth mindset within the class. I mentioned here Carol Dweck, I think it's a reference to all of us. And changing the approach to errors, which is a teacher should value mistakes and errors and make it a learning opportunity. Teaching to think creatively, teaching to learn, because we will have to reinvent ourselves frequently, and teaching student agency. And just to finalize my long presentation, I want to share with you my utopia, in the good sense of the word. What do I dream with? I dream with a school for the future, where everyone learns, where you can have excellence, but you can have excellence with equity, and not excellent schools for the elite students and something else, or second-class education for the poor, the kids from vulnerable areas. A school that is not divorced from society, a school that is able to receive with flexible curricula the kids that have left the schools. And in Brazil, we have 23% of the adolescents are what we called name, which means are neither working nor studying. So we have to bring back to school the ones that have left. A school where both students and teachers work collaboratively. A school that teaches values and attitudes and not only content. A school that takes advantage of what I mentioned about Edgar Morin, that where knowledge is not fragmented in 13 subject areas that do not connect to each other. A school that teaches and learns how to think and not only content, and a school that promotes autonomy, the mentioned dream of Paulo Freire, of Maria Montessori, of many thinkers of education. Thank you.